December 19th, 1944. Chef Headquarters, Versailles, France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower watches as his senior commanders file into the briefing room, their faces drawn with exhaustion and barely concealed alarm. The largest German offensive in the West since 1940 has ripped a 50-mile bulge through American lines in the Ardennes. 3 entire divisions are encircled at Bastogne. The weather has grounded Allied air power for 3 days straight, and sitting across the table smoking a cigar with an expression that borders on satisfaction is Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. Eisenhower needs a miracle. He needs someone to wheel the entire Third Army 90 degrees north, disengage from active combat operations in the Saar, move 6 divisions across icy roads in the middle of winter, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration. Most of his staff believe it will take a week, maybe 10 days. Some think it's impossible altogether. Then Eisenhower asks the question everyone's been dreading. When can you attack? Patton doesn't hesitate. December 22nd, 3 divisions. The room goes silent. Several generals exchange glances. That's 72 hours away. To move over 133,000 men, 60,000 vehicles, and conduct a 90-degree pivot of an entire army group while maintaining combat effectiveness would require logistics that don't exist, staff work that can't be done in time, and a commander willing to risk everything on a single bold maneuver. What nobody else in that room understood was that Patton had already done the impossible part, and what American armor would accomplish in the next 48 hours would be studied by military strategists for the next 80 years. By mid-December 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had ground to a frustrating stalemate. After the breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Paris, Eisenhower's armies had outrun their supply lines. The failure of Operation Market Garden in September had closed the northern route into Germany. Now, as winter descended, American forces were stretched thin across a 400-mile front from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The Third Army under Patton had been battering against the German West Wall fortifications in the Saar region for weeks. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Casualties were mounting. The fighting had devolved into the kind of attritional warfare that ground up divisions and produced little strategic gain. It was exactly the kind of combat Patton despised. Meanwhile, 85 miles to the north, the Ardennes forest sector was considered a quiet zone. The terrain, dense forests, steep ravines, limited road networks, was deemed unsuitable for major offensive operations. 4 understrength American divisions held a front that doctrine said required at least 8. Allied intelligence had convinced itself that Germany no longer possessed the resources for a significant counteroffensive. They were catastrophically wrong. At 0530 hours on December 16th, over 200,000 German troops from 3 armies smashed into the thinly held American lines. More than 1,900 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. Panzer divisions equipped with the formidable Panther and Tiger tanks exploited gaps with terrifying speed. Within 72 hours, German spearheads had penetrated 40 miles into Allied territory, surrounded the critical road junction at Bastogne, and were driving toward the Meuse River. The goal was audacious: split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west. The offensive caught American forces completely by surprise. Communications broke down. Units were overrun before they could establish defensive positions. The 106th Infantry Division, in combat for less than a week, saw 2 of its regiments destroyed, nearly 8,000 men forced to surrender in the largest mass capitulation of U.S. forces in the European theater. Panic spread through rear area units as German commandos in American uniforms sowed confusion and rumors that paratroopers were landing everywhere. Major General Troy Middleton, the 8th Corps commander, described the initial reports as a complete fog of war situation where nobody knew where anybody was. Artillery battalions were firing in all directions. Supply dumps were burning. Refugees and retreating soldiers clogged the few roads not yet in German hands. Weather compounded the disaster. Heavy cloud cover and fog grounded Allied air superiority, the technological advantage that had defined the campaign since D-Day. Without tactical air support, American infantry divisions were fighting German armor on brutally unequal terms. The Luftwaffe, husbanding resources for months, appeared in the skies over the Ardennes for the first time in force since Normandy. By December 18th, the situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division and remnants of 3 armored commands were encircled at Bastogne, holding a perimeter that shrank hourly under relentless German assault. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces in the north, was talking about pulling back to defensive lines. Some staff officers at SHAEF were quietly discussing contingency plans for evacuating supplies from forward depots. What the Allies needed was a counterattack powerful enough to blunt the German offensive before it reached the Meuse. But launching such an attack required moving massive forces through winter conditions across a logistics network already strained to breaking, while German armor was still advancing. Conventional military planning suggested it couldn't be done quickly enough to matter. The German High Command had calculated carefully. Their intelligence assessment concluded that Allied armies, particularly American forces, lacked the operational flexibility for rapid, large-scale redeployment. German doctrine emphasized meticulous preparation. Moving an army required weeks of planning, stockpiling supplies at forward dumps, coordinating with air and artillery assets, establishing communication networks. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's staff estimated that even if the Americans attempted to shift forces from the Saar sector, it would take 10 to 14 days to disengage, redeploy, and mount an effective counterattack. By then, German spearheads would be across the Meuse. The window of Allied vulnerability would be exploited before American armor could respond. This assessment wasn't arrogance. It was based on sound military principles. Moving the Third Army, approximately 250,000 men when including supporting units, would mean rotating the entire force 90 degrees, while maintaining defensive positions in the Saar. Roads would be iced over. Supply lines would need complete reorganization. Artillery would need to displace and re-establish firing positions. Tactical air support would need new coordination procedures with different ground units. Staff officers at SHAEF shared the German skepticism, if not for the same reasons. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, believed that pulling Patton's army out of the Saar would hand the Germans a propaganda victory and allow them to reinforce their West Wall defenses. Others argued that the Third Army's logistics tail simply couldn't support a rapid pivot. Fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing were already in short supply. What made the maneuver particularly daunting was the road network. The Ardennes region was served by limited hard surface roads, and those few routes were now clogged with retreating American units, Belgian refugees, and German infiltrators. Military police were stopping vehicles at gunpoint to verify identities. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Moving 6 divisions north would require absolute priority on those same roads, while simultaneously evacuating hospitals, supply dumps, and rear echelon personnel. The mathematics were brutal. Third Army would need to move an average of 50,000 vehicles over roads covered in ice and snow, maintain radio silence to avoid tipping off German intelligence, coordinate with units currently in combat, and arrive at jump-off positions ready to attack. Not exhausted, disorganized, and strung out along 100 miles of highway. Allied commanders had seen what happened when armies tried to move too fast. Market Garden had been a disaster, precisely because British XXX Corps couldn't advance quickly enough up a single highway. The logistics of modern mechanized warfare imposed limits that no amount of courage or determination could overcome, or so everyone believed. But George Patton had never accepted conventional wisdom about what was possible. While other generals at SHAEF saw an impossible logistics problem, he saw an opportunity. And while they were still discussing contingencies and fallback positions on December 18th, Patton had already set in motion a plan so audacious that even his own staff thought he'd lost his mind. They didn't know that he'd been preparing for exactly this moment for weeks. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Battle of the Bulge. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about Patton's relief of Bastogne before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II military history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. What Eisenhower and the other generals didn't know was that George Patton had already wargamed this exact scenario. On December 12th, 4 days before the German offensive began, Patton had gathered his staff at 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy and posed a hypothetical question. If the Germans attacked in the Ardennes, how quickly could 3rd Army pivot north to counterattack? His operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, thought it was another one of Patton's theoretical exercises. But Patton insisted. He ordered his staff to develop 3 contingency plans, each based on attacking with a different number of divisions. The plans were coded with meaningless titles to avoid drawing attention: nickel, dime, and quarter. Each plan specified routes, assembly areas, artillery displacement schedules, and logistics requirements. When word reached Nancy on the evening of December 16th that Germans had broken through in the Ardennes, Patton's chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, immediately pulled the contingency files. By the time Eisenhower called the emergency meeting in Versailles for December 19th, 3rd Army staff had already been working 72 straight hours on the operational details. The meeting at SHAEF on that cold Tuesday morning was tense. Eisenhower opened by declaring that the German offensive was an opportunity, not a disaster. If the Allies could react quickly enough, they could trap and destroy the German armored spearheads. But that required someone attacking from the south, while Montgomery's forces applied pressure from the north. All eyes turned to Patton. "I can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd, he said. Not might be able to. Not if logistics permit. A flat statement of fact. The room erupted. British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder called it impossible. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers said Patton was talking nonsense. Even Eisenhower's deputy, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, suggested that perhaps Eisenhower should reconsider who was commanding 3rd Army. Patton pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began reading coordinates, unit designations, and route assignments. He had 3 complete plans ready for execution, depending on how many divisions Eisenhower wanted committed. 6 divisions could attack by December 23rd, if needed, but the lead elements of 3 divisions, 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, could jump off in 72 hours. Eisenhower studied his subordinate's face, looking for the bravado or recklessness that often characterized Patton's pronouncements. But Patton wasn't grandstanding. He had done the staff work. His operations officer had calculated fuel requirements down to the gallon. His logistics chief had already started repositioning supply dumps. His artillery commander had reconnaissance teams identifying firing positions along the planned axis of advance. "Make it so," Eisenhower said quietly. What happened next would be analyzed in staff colleges for generations. At 30 hours on December 19th, Third Army Headquarters transmitted execute orders for Operation Nickel. Across an 80-mile front in the Saar, 6 divisions received orders to break contact with the enemy, wheel 90 degrees north, and march. Over 133,000 men, more than 60,000 vehicles, 11,000 tons of supplies that needed to be relocated to new dumps positioned along the northern axis. The movement began at midnight. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division pulled out of positions near Sarreguemines and began the 120-mile march toward Ardennes, Belgium. Behind them, the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions disengaged from active combat and began their own northward displacement. In the bitter cold and darkness, convoy after convoy rolled through the night. Military police established traffic control points at every major intersection. Engineers cleared roads, erected directional signs, and positioned recovery vehicles at intervals to prevent disabled trucks from blocking the route. Quartermasters staged fuel dumps every 20 miles. Signal Corps teams strung wire and established radio relays to maintain communications during the movement. The weather was abysmal. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Roads turned to ice. Vehicles skidded off embankments. Drivers wrapped chains around tires and drove with blackout lights, navigating by memory and occasional flashlight signals from MPs standing in knee-deep snow. The 4th Armored Division alone stretched for over 100 miles from lead tank to rear supply truck. Patton drove the column personally, appearing at bottlenecks in his Jeep with its distinctive 3-star placard. When a bridge near Longwy collapsed under the weight of Sherman tanks, engineers had a Bailey Bridge erected in 4 hours. When fuel trucks couldn't keep pace with the armored spearhead, Patton ordered every available jerrycan filled and distributed by liaison aircraft. When division commanders reported that their men were exhausted, Patton told them, "The men in Bastogne are more tired than you are." By the morning of December 21st, advance elements of the 4th Armored were in assembly areas south of Ardennes. Artillery battalions were positioning their 100mm and 100mm howitzers. Infantry regiments were moving into line. The entire 3rd Army had pivoted 90 degrees in 48 hours while maintaining combat effectiveness. German intelligence was stunned. Intercepts from Wehrmacht units reported massive American reinforcements arriving from the south. Panzer commanders who had been told they wouldn't face serious resistance for another week were suddenly receiving reports of American armor probing their flanks. The German 5th Panzer Army, which had been driving west toward the Meuse, now had to divert forces south to protect its exposed southern flank. At 600 hours on December 22nd, exactly 72 hours after Patton had made his promise to Eisenhower, the artillery of 3 Corps opened fire. 150 guns launched a rolling barrage against German positions south of Bastogne. Behind the curtain of high explosive, Sherman tanks and armored infantry carriers surged forward. The relief of Bastogne had begun. What made Patton's maneuver possible wasn't superhuman effort or reckless disregard for military logistics. It was a fundamental difference in command philosophy that separated Patton from almost every other senior Allied commander. While British doctrine and much of American doctrine emphasized centralized planning and methodical preparation, Patton had built 3rd Army around the German concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders. His subordinate commanders weren't given detailed instructions about how to accomplish objectives. They were told what needed to be achieved and trusted to determine the methods. When the movement order went out on December 19th, division commanders didn't wait for detailed route schedules or supply plans from higher headquarters. They grabbed maps, identified roads, and started moving. Regimental commanders made on-the-spot decisions about priorities. Battalion commanders solved problems as they encountered them. The entire army functioned as a decentralized organism with thousands of officers making independent decisions that aligned with Patton's intent. This required trust. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division, received nothing more than a map with an objective circle around Bastogne and the instruction, "Get there fast." He didn't wait for Corps headquarters to tell him which roads to use or where to position his combat commands. He launched reconnaissance parties ahead of the main body, identified choke points, and started moving before he had complete logistics support arranged. The trust extended downward. When Captain William Dwight, commanding a tank company in the 4th Armored's 37th Tank Battalion, encountered a blown bridge on December 21st, he didn't radio battalion headquarters for instructions. He consulted with his platoon leaders, identified a ford 2 miles downstream, and crossed there. His initiative saved 4 hours for the entire combat command following behind him. But the deeper revelation was in Patton's contingency planning. While other commanders had dismissed the possibility of a German offensive in the Ardennes as unlikely, Patton had studied the terrain, analyzed the thin American deployment, and recognized vulnerability. His chief of intelligence, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning since early December that German armored divisions were missing from the order of battle in front of Third Army positions. They had to be somewhere. Patton's genius wasn't in predicting exactly what would happen. It was in asking what if and having his staff develop plans before crisis struck. When Eisenhower needed a miracle on December 19th, Patton already had the miracle planned, coordinated, and ready for execution. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College concluded that Patton's redeployment violated every conventional timeline for moving mechanized forces, but succeeded because subordinate commanders internalized the Army commander's operational philosophy and exercised initiative without waiting for permission. The study noted that Third Army suffered fewer vehicles broken down during the movement than would normally be expected during peacetime training exercises over the same distance. German commanders were genuinely shocked. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "We knew Patton was opposite us in the Saar. We calculated he could not reach the Bastogne sector in strength for at least 7 days. When his armor hit our southern flank on the morning of December 22nd, we realized we had underestimated not the American army, but one American general." The logistical achievement was staggering. In the 72 hours between December 19th and December 22nd, Third Army moved 133,178 men, 60,154 vehicles, and consumed 60,380 gallons of fuel per hour during movement. Ammunition expenditure on December 22nd alone, once the attack began, exceeded 15,000 rounds of 105mm artillery shells. Not a single division reported being combat ineffective due to supply shortages. Patton had done what the German General Staff considered impossible, and he'd done it in a snowstorm. The attack that began on December 22nd wasn't an immediate breakthrough. German resistance south of Bastogne was fierce, anchored by elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and the Panzer Lehr Division. Winter weather continued to hamper operations. Visibility dropped to near zero in snow squalls. Sherman tanks slid off icy roads. Infantry advanced through waist-deep snowdrifts under fire from dug-in machine gun positions. But Patton's armor kept attacking. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command R, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, pushed through the villages of Chaumont and Nompré, grinding forward against determined resistance. On December 26th, 4 days after Third Army launched its counteroffensive, lead elements of the 37th Tank Battalion reached the perimeter of Bastogne. The siege was broken. The psychological impact was immediate. The 101st Airborne and attached units had held Bastogne against overwhelming odds. But ammunition was nearly exhausted and casualties were mounting. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous response to German surrender demands, "Nuts," had become legend, but legend wouldn't stop panzer attacks. The arrival of American armor shifted momentum across the entire Ardennes front. German commanders had to make agonizing choices: continue driving west toward the Meuse, leaving their southern flank exposed to Patton's growing strength, or pull divisions away from the offensive to contain Third Army. Field Marshal Walter Model chose the latter, effectively ending German offensive capability. By early January, Wehrmacht forces were in full retreat. The Battle of the Bulge would rage until late January 1945, ultimately costing the U.S. Army over 89,000 casualties, the bloodiest battle Americans fought in the European theater. But Patton's rapid response prevented catastrophe. Post-war studies concluded that if Third Army had taken even 5 additional days to attack, German spearheads would have reached the Meuse River, potentially splitting Allied forces and creating a crisis that could have extended the war by months. George Patton received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the Ardennes campaign, though he characteristically dismissed the decoration as insufficient recognition for his soldiers' achievements. The 4th Armored Division earned a Presidential Unit Citation. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, whose tanks had spearheaded the relief of Bastogne, would go on to command U.S. forces in Vietnam and have the M1 Abrams tank named in his honor. But the broader legacy was doctrinal. Patton's rapid redeployment became a case study in operational flexibility. NATO doctrine during the Cold War emphasized exactly this kind of responsive maneuver, the ability to shift combat power rapidly to exploit opportunities or counter threats. The U.S. Army's airland battle doctrine of the 1980s owed significant debt to lessons learned from Third Army's performance in December 1944. The German General Staff's assessment proved prophetic. They had underestimated one American general, but more than that, they had underestimated what became possible when a commander trusted subordinates, emphasized initiative over procedure, and planned for contingencies before crisis struck. 7 months after Bastogne, Patton's Third Army was deep inside Germany, having advanced farther and faster than any other Allied army. His methods, controversial, aggressive, often at odds with higher headquarters, had been vindicated by results that spoke for themselves. The story of Patton's relief of Bastogne teaches a truth that transcends military history. Bureaucracy is the enemy of velocity. Every layer of approval, every requirement for detailed planning, every insistence on following procedure adds time. And in crisis, time is measured in lives. Patton succeeded because he had done something radical. He had prepared for a battle that wasn't happening yet. While other commanders focused on the mission in front of them, Patton's staff was wargaming scenarios that seemed hypothetical. When the hypothetical became horrifyingly real, the preparation made the impossible merely difficult. But preparation alone wasn't enough. What separated Patton from his contemporaries was his willingness to trust subordinates with incomplete information and delegate authority downward. He built an army that didn't wait for orders. Thousands of officers made independent decisions aligned with commanders' intent, creating an organizational velocity that rigid command structures couldn't match. December 19, 1944, a confident promise made in a room full of skeptics. 72 hours later, American armor attacking through a snowstorm to save a surrounded garrison. One general who understood that audacity, properly prepared, isn't recklessness. It's decisive action when others are still calculating odds. The Third Army's 90-degree pivot proved something the German General Staff thought impossible, that American forces could match or exceed German operational tempo when led by commanders who rejected conventional limitations. Sometimes the miracle isn't what happens, It's what was prepared for before anyone knew a miracle would be needed. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.